My name's Sophie Dixon. I'm a visual artist, educator. So I'm a visual artist, educator, and co-founder of Nemesine, a company working with cultural heritage institutions to engage audiences with their digital collections. Lux in Tenebris, Light in Darkness, is a VR experience created during a 2-month digital residency with the Deutsche Museum, sort of late summer last year. And my focus in the residency was on the museum's astronomical collection. The Deutsche Museum's in Germany, and it's the largest science and technology museum in the world, with around 28,000 objects from 50 different fields of science and technology. And it was a remote residency. So it was an online residency where I was given access to the museum's digital collection to create a digital output for audiences to engage with in their VR lab. And in this presentation, what I'll do is I will start by showing documentation, a video of the final piece, and then share a breakdown of my process. Can I just check that the slide just changed? Because I can't see. Okay, hopefully it did. So before I play a video, it's a 1-minute long video which shows the VR experience. I'll just describe a little bit about what you are seeing. So it was created using Unreal Engine. It's a room scale VR experience for the Rift S, which is the headset that was available in the VR lab. In the middle of the virtual environment is a 3D model created from a drawing by Johannes Kepler in his book Mysterium Cosmographicum. And around the edges of the space are 3D models of AI generated interpretations of the universe created using prompts, images of objects in the museum's collection, and Blender, a 3D modeling software. And the user wearing a Rift S headset can move freely around the space to explore the environment and look at the models in more detail. So I will show you a short video of the piece, and you should also be able to hear sound. Sorry, muted. A bit of background for the project. The starting point for the project was the museum's astronomical collection, and I was interested in how astronomical models are often partial, necessarily inaccurate, and present us with processes through which seemingly immaterial ideas have throughout history been made manifest. So what I find intriguing about these models is how they hold a mirror to the minds of the people and the times in which they were created, the sense-making, the logic, and the egocentrisms which contribute to the way that we conceive of the world around us. So for example, the transition from the geocentric model, in which we believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe, to the heliocentric model, in which we realized that planets, including the Earth, orbited around the sun. And this was a theory presented by Nicholas Copernicus in 1543, which paved the way for the Enlightenment, which was an important development where we shifted, a hugely important development, from where we shifted our focus from religion to reason. And through my research into Copernicus's work and the Enlightenment more generally, I came across this book in the museum's collection. And this was a book, by Johannes Kepler, Harmonies of the World, published in 1619. And what I found particularly interesting about Kepler's book is how artistic I think it is. So for example, in his book, he revisits an earlier medieval philosophical idea that the planets of the solar system produce tones as they orbit the sun. So the planets have a harmony that they play. And he also sought to explain the universe using geometry. So he was looking for patterns, but there's also this artistic sensibility about his interpretations. From this research, I looked at other books written by Kepler, including Mysterium Cosmographicum, which was published in 1597 and translates as The Secret of the Cosmos. And in this book, Kepler sought to defend Copernicus's heliocentric perspective. And he took Copernicus's 2D diagram that you can see on the left, and he wanted to explain the distances between planets. And to do this, he drew or created this diagram that you can see on the right, this 3D representation. And Kepler proposed that the reason that the distances between the planets are as they are is because each planet sits inside a platonic solid. So he's very interested in geometry, and he proposed that there are five platonic solids, and each planet sits inside a different platonic solid, and that is why the distances are as they are. And of course, now we know that this isn't the reason why we have these distances between planets, but looking at this diagram, I felt this was a very intriguing and appealing idea visually. So I modeled, based on the diagram that you can see on the right, I created the model that you can see here and put it into a white box. So in VR, I put it into VR and I played with the scale of it. I wanted to see how it feels to see these models at scale, and overall, the kind of aim of the project wasn't to be informative, but rather to create a sense of wonder. And at the time of thinking about the museum's models and the Enlightenment, there was this huge proliferation of AI arts, experimentation, and also readily available tools. So kind of out-the-box tools like Midjourney. And I started to wonder whether the tools, these AI tools, could be used to interpret existing models of the universe from the museum's collection in the same way that Kepler had sought to expand upon Copernicus's theory. So, for example, if I tasked an AI to imagine a vision of the universe, what would it create? And could I create new visualizations and models using tools such as Midjourney combined with 3D workflows and images of astronomical instruments from the museum's collection? So I started to experiment. As I said, this was a 2-month residency, so I had time to explore different ideas. I created images using Midjourney, using a large number of imagined parameters. So the parameters were crafted through ideas from the research. For example, imagine a vast and intricate model of the universe. And then to provide visual inspiration for the outputs, I linked to, via a URL, I linked to images in the museum's collection. So for example, this prompt came back with images such as this. And I generated, I don't know how many hundreds of images over this at the stage of the residency. And I experimented with adding in image prompts using not just one model, but multiple models, and came out with some interesting results. This was an example where I didn't use any images from museum's collection, just to see what it would come back with using just the text parameters. And again, so all of these are created using the image that you can see there from the museum's catalogue. And one of the things that obviously that you can do with things like Midjourney is you find an image that you like, you can just keep creating variations of it. So this was a final outcome created for creating variations from the images that you can see here. And it has quite a sort of architectural quality to it. And in the process of the residency, Midjourney created a new version, and I found that the results became very different. So the image on the left was a later version of Midjourney compared to the image on the right, and you can see that it kind of became a bit more polished, maybe a bit more cinematic. And yeah, it kept, so there's a few more images showing some of the outputs, again, quite architectural. At one point, I started through the research to think about religious connotations of the Enlightenment, and using that language in the prompts themselves. So, thinking, if we move from God to reason, are we now moving back to more of some kind of God that we don't fully comprehend? And again, some of the outcomes. Here, what I was doing was taking some of the images that were generated and using Photoshop to combine them. So I kind of called it like a sort of mashup approach. So I would take a number of images that were generated for using Midjourney, use Photoshop to kind of collage them, and then put that collage back into Midjourney to see what kind of results I would get. So some results like this, for example. So it's a kind of back and forth really between, obviously the prompts greatly influence what you get back out, but then collaging together different outputs to see what you might get back if you put it into AI again, back into Midjourney. I also tried to combine at one point many URLs. So I was thinking what would happen to the outcomes if I referenced not just one or two objects in the catalogue, but a larger number. So for example, in this prompt, there were lots of different URLs linking to different images in the catalogue of astronomical instruments. And the outcomes became very complex. So although visually they look appealing or interesting, if you were thinking about then turning those into 3D models for a VR space, for example, it became a bit more difficult. At one point, the parameters had reference to humans. I can't quite, I think it was something like the model exceeds the knowledge of man. And I had the word man or human in, and it started to come up with these quite sort of fleshy landscapes, which I quite liked. I also tried just putting objects from the catalogue in to see what Midjourney would produce with very limited text parameter. And again, some later Midjourney experiments. I took, at one point, I was taking Kepler's diagrams and using them as a reference for Midjourney to see what diagrams Midjourney would produce. And all the time I was thinking about how to, from these outputs, create a virtual environment from this process. What might that virtual environment look like? So at this point, I was thinking about creating models that I could turn into 3D representations to put into VR. But with the 3D process, there are other ways of integrating 2D images, for example. So rather than just saying, well, we're going to use a 2D image as concept art for a 3D output, I started thinking about, could I just use Midjourney to create some textures, for example, to create tileable textures of 3D models. And this was really effective. So again, linking back to kind of geometry and Kepler's work, I started to create tileable textures very easily using Midjourney, and then creating using Substance Designer to add sort of roughness and normal maps, and thinking about how to, again, take those outcomes from the Midjourney process into the environment. And again, this is more Midjourney experimentation. So it took quite a long time, I think, to find the sort of prompts that were producing outputs that I was happy with. And what I also started to do was take images from Midjourney and feed them into other software like DALL-E. So in this example, I took an image produced in Midjourney, I put it into DALL-E, and then I saw what DALL-E did with it. And actually, I quite liked the results from that output. They're a little bit simpler, I found. It could just be coincidence, but here are some examples of the variations it produced. And one of the things, particularly about these images, is that they often, to the eye, they look like they make sense. But then when you really examine them in order to create 3D models from them, you realize that things don't actually join up correctly. Like they look okay immediately, but when you start trying to join things up in a 3D space, edges don't meet, or it's a kind of impossible shape, for example. So, I mean, this is a little bit of an example here. This was a variation from this previous one. And I decided, okay, I think this is something that I'd like to model, to take into the space. And there's a 3D model on the left there, and the original image on the right, and they're not identical, but it was that kind of process of taking the 2D AI generated images and thinking about how to replicate those in a 3D manner. And once I had these models, the idea was to kind of create 6 models, loosely linked to the idea that there were sort of 6 known planets at the time of Copernicus. I started to think about, well, what kind of environment are all of these going to sit in? And the inspiration for the VR environment was taken from the Pantheon in Rome. Walter Murch is he's a very, very well-known film editor, and he's also incredibly keen on astronomy. And I read this interview of him during the sort of design stage, where he was discussing a theory that Copernicus's diagram that you can see on the left is heavily influenced by the ceiling of the Pantheon in Rome, or the roof of the Pantheon in Rome. And if you actually take Copernicus's diagram on the left and put it over the Pantheon, it lines up exactly. And Murch was talking about how, about the age of 27, Copernicus goes to Rome, stands in the Pantheon, looks up, sees this amazing oculus and roof, and this inspires his later diagram that he makes, or his later theory that he goes on to produce much later in his life. And I think it's subtle, but that the reference to the Pantheon, the reference to the oculus, the heliocentric model, these kind of all inspired the architecture that was created to house Kepler's model and the AI generated models. So you can see there's sort of some images of the wireframe of that architecture. The sound for the piece was created from something found in the track found in the NASA archives. It's the vibrations of the sun, and then that's kind of really stretched out. So that was what created the music that you can hear, or the sound that you can hear in the VR scene. So here you can see that's the architecture, Kepler's model in the middle, and then these AI generated models kind of paying homage to it. And I'll just show you the models that were produced to finish with. So here is the model I showed earlier. And it was interesting kind of taking a 2D, almost like a piece of concept art, and then thinking about how to animate and texture and position these inside VR. With this one, so that's an AI image from, generated image from DALL-E, and on the right, I experimented with using software that takes 2D images and just instantly transforms into 3D models, which is amazing. And I think this is definitely the future. But at the time of using it, I still felt that the outputs were not as, I didn't think that they were as good as if I were to hand model. So for example, with this model here, I did experiment with using an AI tool that would take the image, create a 3D model, but in the end, I still modeled it myself. But it was an interesting experiment. And I think given the time, it was quite limited. It was a couple of months for the whole process. I probably would have done a bit more of texturing, etc. Time allowed. With some of the images like this one, I used a basic geometry and then applied shaders to create something that looked more similar to the reference image. And again, here it was like a combination of 3D modeling and shaders to create the appearance of light coming out of the holes. And I think sometimes the models look more like the reference images than others. For example, this one, the image is a bit more intricate than the 3D model, but the 3D model is a combination of 3D animated model with shape keys, and then a shader to create the appearance of the sort of membrane inside. And this is the final one. Again, using shaders, textures, and 3D modeling. And that is the end of my presentation. So very happy to take any questions.